Hey, what is up guys? My name is Stan and welcome to another video. So in the last one, I actually unboxed and we took a first look at the RTX 3090 Founders Edition that I had recently picked up. And since then, I have actually installed it in the system that you see right behind me here. So this system is a custom water-cooled PC that has a CPU loop and a GPU loop. So I had originally planned on only draining one of the loops, but I ended up having to drain both of them, and there was a huge complication. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Later in this video, we'll talk about the performance increases, the benchmarks on a handful of games from the 1080 Ti versus the 3090 that I had just recently installed. So let's get into it. So my main rig here is built with productivity in mind. It's actually got a Threadripper 3960X 24-core CPU with a water-cooled 1080 Ti up until now. Pulling the 1080 Ti really wasn't that complicated. All I needed to do was drain the loop, and I have a little ball valve on the side here to drain the loop, and all the water gushed out, no problem. And then disconnecting the tubing to the 1080 Ti was pretty simple as well. So I pulled the 1080 Ti out relatively easily. And when it was time to get the 3090 into the system, that's when I ran into an issue, because the 3090 is so dang big that it interferes with some of the existing tubing that I have in the system. And because I wanted to be a little extra here, I decided not to use acrylic or PETG or even brass tubing for my setup. I went with glass tubing, and because glass tubing glass is brittle, right? And when I was trying to get that 3090 in there and I was bending that glass tubing, it was angled in a way that cracked the glass right at the fitting. So I started leaking water. Well, shoot. At that point, I realized that I had to drain the CPU loop, pull all the glass tubing out, and decided that I would be using some old compression fittings with some flexible tube just to get the water loop reconnected. While doing that, unfortunately, while I wasn't paying attention, I managed to crack another tube on the backside of my computer. And while filling the CPU loop and turning it on to bleed the system, I started squirting water out from the backside of this computer, and it totally drenched me, got water everywhere. I had to turn off the computer, shut it down, try to mop up all the mess and everything. So that was quite an ordeal. So I had to replace the glass tubing on the back with more flexible hose and fill the CPU loop. So currently, as it sits right now, I've got a flex tube on the front side and a flex tube on the back side with the CPU loop, and currently the GPU loop is just dangling there, just with the 3090 and everything pushed aside, pump disconnected, whatnot. So anyway, I've got the 3090 in there, it's running, it's working, it's all good. So clearly I've got to fix this system up eventually once I decide to go water cooling with the 3090. So I probably got at least another few more weeks in this temporary state for this system. So talking about the performance increase between the 1080 Ti and the 3090. I think it's important to note that the monitor that I'm using is a 38-inch ultra-wide LG high refresh rate monitor that's good for 175 Hertz, and the resolution is 3840 by 1600. To put it into perspective here, it's a kind of halfway between 1440p and 4K. So 1440p, for example, is 30.6 megapixels. 4K is about 8 megapixels. So this comes in right around 6.1 megapixels. So up until now with the 1080 Ti and this monitor, I've been able to get anywhere from 60 to 100 FPS in most games. Unfortunately, with the new titles such as Cyberpunk 2077 or Control, I've been seeing a huge dip in FPS, especially with the quality of the games increasing by quite a bit. So for example, on Cyberpunk 2077, I'm pulling about 25 to 30 FPS, let's just say 28 FPS on high preset with this resolution. So with the 3090 now, again, on the high preset, I'm pulling about, how much? 70 frames per second. So it went from about 28 to 70 frames per second just on that high preset. And I think what is very important is the addition of DLSS and ray tracing. So with ray tracing all enabled to the maximum and with DLSS set to either performance or balance, somewhere in between, I'm still able to get to hover around that 70 to 80 FPS with basically everything maxed out in Cyberpunk 27 on this resolution here. So you can see here, that's more than a doubling of the frame rates going from that 1080 Ti to the 3090. The other game that I was really struggling on with is Control. And previously Control, I was doing about 35 frames per second on a high preset. Now, 35 frames per second really isn't very playable, so of course you can knock down the resolution, or not the resolution, but the quality. But just as an example here, on a high preset, I would be getting 35 frames per second. Now on the 3090, getting somewhere close to about 80 frames per second. Especially when you're enabling ray tracing and DLSS on top of that, you're still able to maintain that 80 or 90 frames per second in that game, depending on the, what you're seeing and what the scene is. But still, that is more than 60 frames per second, and especially with a G-Sync and a high refresh rate, ultra wide monitor, is really, really impressive, and it plays so much better than 30, 40 frames per second that I was seeing before. As for some synthetics here, I've got Heaven running right behind me on the Extreme preset. I did about 4566 score with about 181 FPS on the 1080 Ti. Going to the 3090, I got a score of 6614 with a FPS of 260, so about 44% performance increase. Also, Time Spy, the 1080 Ti did a score of 10,435. While the 3090 did a score of 14,360. Now, that's right around 40% performance increase. Now, I do want to point out that, again, I'm running a 3960X 24-core processor, Zen 2 processor. It's not a gaming processor. It's only able to PBO up to like 4.4 gigahertz. So clearly, I am leaving performance on the table. So, I understand that, but it's still nice to see that there is quite a bit jump in performance. Now, speaking of which here, the CPU bottleneck is real, especially in two of the main games I play, which is Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft. Both games, clearly you're not going to be buying a 3090 for those games, right? Those are MMOs and not very graphically intensive. But that said here, just to put into perspective here, in World of Warcraft, if you're pulling about, let's say, 70 FPS in Stormwind, right? With that 3090, you're still pulling about 70 FPS in Stormwind just because of the CPU bottleneck that you're going to be seeing, especially with this processor. Similarly, in Final Fantasy XIV, depending on where you're at, in very crowded areas, you're going to see that CPU get bottlenecked, and you're going to be pulling anywhere from 60 or 70 frames per second on the 1080 Ti or on the 3090, just because that single core performance is completely maxed out. You have 24 cores in the CPU, but that one single core is completely maxed out, and you're truly bottlenecked because of that. So, if you're looking to upgrade your graphics card, be it a 3080 or a 3090, just take a look at what kind of games you're actually playing and see if it really makes sense to upgrade that GPU, or is a CPU upgrade also necessary. So, just to keep in mind. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the general experience of owning a Founders Edition 3000 series graphics card. And I'm pretty sure this will apply for the 3080 as well as the 3090. So The cooler design of this graphics card is really good, meaning it's virtually silent when in idle. I've got a lot of fans in this case, but they are all General Typhoons, and I'm running them around at 500 or 600 RPMs, meaning they're virtually silent. So the 3090 cannot be heard, especially when it's idle, over the case fans. You only hear something when you have it completely stressed out, like what I'm doing right now, running a Heaven benchmark in the background here. You can see that the temperature is sitting right at 70 degrees Celsius. And this is actually with a mild overclock on the card. I'm actually running about 100 megahertz offset on the core, so I'm right around 2000 megahertz, up and down depending on power limit and voltage limit, and about a 250 megahertz offset on the memory, so right around 10 gigahertz on the memory. So a mild overclock, nothing too extreme, especially for the 3090 on air. Now, with the default fan profile, the fan is sitting at about 40% speed, so it's not even ramping up to 50, 60, 70, or very high speeds here. Only at 40% speed, and I could very vaguely hear it over the case fans. I know it's running, I know it's rampant, but it's certainly not annoying. What is annoying, however, is the coil whine that I get from this case fan, or from the GPU. And it's, from what I can tell online, people are complaining about the 3090 being a culprit, or it seems to be a recurring thing with the 3090 Founders Edition, where you get a little bit of a coil whine. Now, coil whine will depend on the frames per second that you're running, or how much power that you're using. I'm using right around 400 watts of power, and I'm pushing, especially in this benchmark here, I'm pushing almost 200, 300 FPS. That said, even with a lower FPS, this 3090 Founders Edition will still coil whine, and I'll show you what I mean. Hopefully you can hear the sound in what I'm talking about here. So that was about 6 inches away from the graphics card inside the case. Now, what I have found is with the case closed, it muffles the coil whine down to the point where it's right around background noise level, kind of acceptable. So with the fans ramped up, with the case fans, with all the other electronics in the background, it kind of just goes away, especially when you're playing a game and when you've got a little bit of volume to whatever game you're running. I don't like using headphones, I like using speakers, so even with the speakers, it's able to drown out the coil whine. Coil whine is something that tends to go away with time, especially after you break it in. So this has only been about 3 or 4 days of me actually using this card. So I'm trying to get this card ramped up, stressed out a little bit with these benchmarks and whatever. So hopefully the coil whine will kind of die down a little bit. But if it doesn't go away, well, oh well. Clearly, if you're in the market for a GPU, you should certainly consider the 3080 or even a 3070. That's a pretty nice graphics card as well. Don't buy the 3090 for just purely gaming. If you're doing video editing or if you're doing productivity work and need that extra VRAM, that's where the 3090 really shines. But for me, I really couldn't get my hands on a 3080. I really wanted one. I couldn't get my hands on a 3080, so I went with a 3090. And I didn't really want to wait to see when a 3080 Ti may or may not come out, or when that may actually be available. So I'm kind of just thankful I have a 3090 in my hands and I get to use the graphics card. Anyway, if you want to see more videos on the 3090, I'll probably be making a few more in the near future, so consider subscribing. And if you want to see other tech or computer related videos, I'll be making those as well. If you enjoyed this video, you can hit that like button, that'd be great. And I'll see you guys in the next one.